If you've looked at your phone, your tablet, or really just walked past any TV screen today, you know exactly what's happening.
Yeah, you really can't escape it right now.
You can't. It is February 23, 2026, and the digital dam has officially broken. The Department of Justice has just unleashed what is arguably the most anticipated and honestly dread-inducing data dump in modern American history. We are talking about the Epstein investigation files.
And it is massive. I mean, calling it a data dump almost feels like an understatement at this point. Yeah. It's more like a data deluge. We are looking at nearly 3.5 million pages of documents.
Wow.
Yeah, over 2,000 video files.
Right.
And roughly 180,000 images.
It's just the absolute definition of information overload. I actually tried logging onto the library website this morning, and honestly, it's paralyzing. You open one folder, and it's just endless PDFs, black bars, legal jargon. For a normal person just trying to make sense of this on a lunch break, it's basically impossible. You just see the volume, not the story.
Right. And that is exactly why we are doing this today. We are definitely not going to read 3.5 million pages to you.
Please, let's not. I don't think we have the years left in our lives to actually do that.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive is to act as a filter. We need to cut through the incredible noise of this massive release and actually connect the dots. We're going to take these new disclosures, which were released under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, and map them against the machinery that made this entire operation possible. So we're going to look at the financial engines, specifically JP Morgan, and then those catastrophic legal failures of the past.
Right, because this isn't just about one guy on an island, it's about the system that let him stay there. So we're essentially looking at three things: the money, the law, and the network.
Yes, and I really want to frame this for you, the listener, right up front. The value here isn't in the shock value. It's not in the clickbait headlines you're going to see flooding your social media feeds for the next week. The real value is in understanding the how. How did major global institutions like banks, like federal prosecutors, how did they fail so completely?
Because they really did.
They absolutely did. When you put the banking compliance reports right next to the DOJ's internal reviews, a very disturbing picture emerges. It wasn't just simple negligence. It was a calculated pattern of prioritizing risk management over actual justice.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with the immediate news, the raw data itself. We've been waiting for this Transparency Act to kick in for a while now. What exactly are we looking at here?
Well, this release is the direct result of the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which President Trump signed into law back in November 2025. And the mandate from Congress was incredibly broad. It was basically just release the files.
Right.
And the DOJ has now done that on a dedicated public library website. But what is fascinating and actually a little controversial is the specific protocol they use for the redactions.
Yeah, because usually when the government releases anything sensitive, it looks like some kind of censorship art project. Just black Sharpie absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
Isn't this different?
It is significantly different this time. The DOJ deployed over 500 attorneys just to review this material. The primary rule, the absolute hard line they drew, was to protect victims. Mm-hmm. And there is a pretty grim detail here that we need to acknowledge regarding the visual evidence.
Go ahead.
The DOJ decided that for any pornographic images included in these files, whether they appeared to be commercial or not, they would treat all women in those images as victims by default. So those are completely redacted or entirely withheld from the public database.
Which makes total sense. I mean, you have to protect the people who are exploited, but what about the other side of the equation? What about the people in power, the enablers?
That is exactly where the shift happens. The protocol explicitly stated there would be no redactions for notable individuals or politicians. So if you're a public figure and your name is in the file, it is out there. Zero shielding.
That feels like a massive change in how Washington usually works. But I was reading the press release from the DOJ earlier, and they used a really weird phrase. They admitted they might have overcollected. What does that mean in this context?
This is the double-edged sword of total transparency. The DOJ press release explicitly states they erred on the side of including everything, and that means the release includes raw materials sent to the FBI by the general public. So we are talking about verified, hard evidence sitting right next to random tips from the public suggestion box.
Wait, hold on. You're saying if I, say, mailed a crazy conspiracy theory to the FBI in 2020 and they just put it in a folder, it's now in this official data dump?
Precisely. and it's treated as part of the official file. In fact, the DOJ actually noted that some documents contain untrue and sensational claims against President Trump that were submitted right before the 2020 election. The DOJ investigated those specific claims at the time and found them to be completely unfounded. But because the Transparency Act mandates the release of the entire file, those false claims are included in the dump today.
Wow. And just to be clear to you listening, we are not taking political sides here or endorsing any of these claims, whether they are about Republicans or Democrats. We are strictly reporting what the DOJ has included in this raw data. But it seems dangerous, doesn't it? It's like polluting the well. You're dumping the entire contents of the internet's imagination mixed in with actual verifiable flight logs.
It creates an incredibly noisy environment. It forces us and the public to be critical thinkers. We have to distinguish between a raw tip submitted by a random person during an election year and a verified bank transaction report. One is just hearsay, the other is hard data.
Okay, so let's pivot to that hard data. The stuff that has a solid paper trail you simply can't fake. Because you cannot talk about an operation of this magnitude, private jets, multiple properties, the private island, the massive payoffs, without talking about the money. Where was it coming from and who is moving it?
This brings us to the financial engine of the whole thing. We need to look at the reporting from Fox Business and the New York Times regarding the JP Morgan Chase relationship. This wasn't just a checking account someone uses for groceries. JP Morgan processed over $1 billion for Epstein over a 15-year period.
$1 billion. That is an enterprise. That is a small corporation.
It is. And the most frustrating part of the banking documents isn't that the bank didn't know what was happening. It's that the bank's internal systems actually worked at first. The alarms absolutely went off. As early as 2006, and remember, that is the year of his first indictment in Florida, compliance officials at the bank were already flagging suspicious activity.
When you say suspicious activity in banking terms, what are we talking about here?
We're talking about cash. Massive, highly illogical amounts of cash. The reports detail routine withdrawals of $40,000 to $80,000 multiple times a month.
$80,000 in cash. I mean, try going to your local branch today and asking for $5,000. They look at you like you're robbing the place. You have to fill out forms. How do you walk out with $80,000 repeatedly without someone stopping you?
Well, normally, that behavior triggers what's called a suspicious activity report, or SAR, and those were filed internally. By 2008, he had withdrawn nearly $1.75 million in hard cash. In the banking world, cash withdrawals of that size without a clear, documented business purpose are a massive red flag for structuring or illicit payments. You just don't pay for legitimate services with duffel bags of cash.
So the compliance people, the police inside the bank, essentially, were screaming about this. Why didn't the bank just fire him as a client?
Because in a major global bank, there is a constant war between the back office, which is compliance and risk, and the front office, the people who actually bring in the revenue.
Yeah.
And the report highlights this tension perfectly. On one side, you had the bank's general counsel, Stephen Cutler. In 2011, Cutler privately urged the bank to drop Epstein. He basically sent up a massive flare saying, this guy is a convicted sex offender, the risk is too high, we need to get out now.
That seems like the only rational move for a general counsel. Let's not bank the convicted sex offender.
It is completely rational if your primary priority is safety and legality. It is not rational if your priority is profit. On the other side of this internal war, you had the business interests. The report highlights Jess Staley, who was the head of investment banking at the time. Staley is reported to have pushed back hard against removing Epstein. And this is a crucial point. The relationship wasn't just about Epstein's own money. It was about who Epstein knew.
He was a gateway.
Exactly. He was a recruiter. The report specifically mentions that Epstein helped land other ultra-high net worth clients for the bank, including people like Google co-founder Sergey Brin.
Wait, really? Epstein brought in Sergey Brin?
According to the reports, yes.
Yeah.
He facilitated those high-level introductions. So when the executives at JP Morgan were looking at Epstein, they weren't just seeing a high-risk client. They were seeing a rainmaker. They were actively weighing the reputational risk of banking a predator against the massive financial upside of his elite network.
And for a long time, the money won.
The money won until 2013. That's how long it took for them to finally sever ties. But by then, they had already facilitated the financial infrastructure that allowed him to operate for arguably his most active and destructive years.
So you have the bank actively looking the other way because of the profit margins. That's the engine. Now let's pivot to the brakes. Because the legal system is supposed to be the thing that stops this kind of enterprise. But in 2008, the brakes didn't just fail, they were basically cut. We need to talk about what they call the deal of a lifetime.
This is the part that genuinely makes you question the integrity of the entire justice system. We're looking at the Office of Professional Responsibility report, the OPR report. To truly understand the magnitude of this failure, you have to go back to 2007. The FBI had actually done the work. They had a 53-page draft indictment ready to go.
53 pages. That's not a slap on the wrist. That's a highly detailed roadmap to federal prison.
It outlined a massive federal case for sex trafficking. It was incredibly serious. But instead of that indictment moving forward to a grand jury, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida at the time, Alexander Acosta, entered into private negotiations. And the result of those talks was the Non-Prosecution Agreement, or NPA.
And for you listening who maybe aren't lawyers, an NPA is basically the federal government saying, we agree not to charge you federally if you just agree to these specific state terms.
Right. And the terms they agreed to were bafflingly lenient. Epstein pled guilty to minor state prostitution charges, not federal sex trafficking. He was sentenced to 18 months, but ultimately served only 13. But the detail that really highlights the pure absurdity of this deal is the work release program.
Oh, I was reading about this. The Florida Science Foundation. It sounds like a bad joke.
It wasn't a joke to him. It was his customized escape hatch. While he was technically incarcerated, the deal literally allowed him to leave the jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, to go work at this foundation.
But what actually was the foundation? Was he in a lab curing cancer?
No, absolutely not. It was a paper entity he incorporated himself, which was physically located in an office suite that also housed his own attorney. So picture this. He wakes up in jail, puts on his tailored suit, gets driven by a chauffeur to a private office where there are no guards, spends 12 hours conducting his business, and highly likely continuing his abusive behavior, and then just goes back to the county jail to sleep.
That is not prison. That is a daily commute. How does a U.S. attorney justify that? How do you look at a 53-page federal indictment from the FBI and trade it for a private workspace in West Palm Beach?
Acosta's justification, which he formally gave to the OPR investigators later, relied on a legal concept called federalism.
Federalism. That sounds like something from a constitutional law class, not a valid reason to let a known predator walk the streets.
It's a very academic constitutional argument. Acosta essentially argued that prostitution is traditionally a state crime, not a federal one. He viewed the feds as just a backstop to the local state authorities. He convinced himself that if he got Epstein to register as a sex offender locally, he had technically done his job, and the rest was up to the state of Florida to handle.
But that completely ignores the reality of sex trafficking, right? The whole point of the FBI investigation was that he was moving victims across state lines. That is the exact definition of federal jurisdiction.
It is. And that's why legal scholars look at this specific deal with such bewilderment today. But honestly, the worst part of the 2008 deal wasn't even the light sentence or the ridiculous work release. It was how they treated the victims.
This is the part of the deep dive that is truly heartbreaking.
It is easily the most damning finding in the entire OPR report. The victims were completely shut out of the legal process. They weren't consulted before the deal was signed. In fact, the report details how the DOJ sent official letters to the victims, telling them the investigation was still ongoing after the non-prosecution agreement had already been signed and sealed.
They just flat out lied to them. They strung them along.
The courts later ruled that those letters were legally misleading. But the OPR report explains the cold, calculating strategy behind it. The federal prosecutors were afraid. They feared that if they told the victims about the plea deal or involved them too much in the process, the defense attorneys would later claim the victims were just in it for a financial payout. They feared creating what they called impeachment evidence.
So to protect their case, a case they weren't even really prosecuting anymore, they silenced the very people they were supposed to be fighting for.
Exactly. They prioritized the perceived integrity of their legal strategy over the basic statutory rights of the human beings involved.
Yeah.
It was a cold, bureaucratic calculation that left the victims completely in the dark while their abuser literally went to work every single day.
It's infuriating. Okay, so we have the money flowing unchecked from JP Morgan. We have the legal cover provided by the 2008 MPA. Now let's talk about the third pillar of this structure, the network. The flight logs.
This is where the new 2026 data dump really shines a very bright light. We've heard rumors for years, but now we have the actual unredacted flight logs from 1995 to 1997 for the aircraft N908JE.
And we should clarify for the listeners, this is different from the little black book, right?
Yes, very different. The little black book is essentially a static Rolodex. It was actually found on the Internet Archive back in 2020, but was officially revealed by the administration in 2025. A contact list just tells you who he knew or had numbers for. The flight logs tell you who he was physically with. These are the daily operational records of who was sitting in the seats on his plane.
So let's look at the passenger list. Who was in those seats during that mid-90s period?
Well, you have the regulars, obviously. Ghislaine Maxwell is ubiquitous. She is on flight after flight. You see names like Sophie Biddle and the Dubin family, Eva, Glenn, Selena appearing constantly. They were the inner circle, basically the furniture of his day-to-day life.
But then you have the names that just stop you in your tracks, the people who ostensibly had no business being there.
Yes. For example, September 8th, 1996, a flight from Columbus, Ohio to Washington, D.C. The passengers listed are Jeffrey Epstein and John Glenn.
The astronaut, Senator John Glenn.
The very same. At that time, he was a sitting United States senator.
Yeah.
Then on that exact same day, the log lists the prominent lawyer Alan Dershowitz on a flight leg involving D.C., Columbus, Teterboro, and Boston.
And I'm looking at the entry for January 5, 1997, a flight from Palm Beach to Newark.
Yes, that entry specifically lists Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and Donald Trump.
And it looks like Mark Epstein, his brother, is on that specific flight as well.
Correct. And we have to be very careful here. Presence on a plane does not prove a crime took place on that plane. But it proves access. It proves proximity. It proves that in the mid-90s, Epstein wasn't some weird outcast. He was deeply in the mix.
He wasn't hiding in the shadows at all. He was flying sitting senators and future presidents between Palm Beach and New York.
Exactly. And speaking of presidents, the Fox Business reports on the new files also mention a Bill Clinton letter found in the so-called birthday book.
Right. And again, just remaining completely impartial here, this shows you have connections spanning the entire political spectrum. Republicans, Democrats, elite scientists, famous lawyers.
And that is the key insight we have to take away from the network data. Don't get distracted by the partisan finger-pointing, where one side just yells about the other side's names. Look at the mix itself. Epstein didn't just hoard money. He hoarded social capital. He intentionally mixed scientists, politicians, financiers, and celebrities together. The flight logs are a visual representation of a shield. When you are flying John Glenn around or banking with the head of investment banking at JP Morgan or partying with Donald Trump or Bill Clinton, you don't look like a creditor to the outside world. You look like a philanthropist. You look untouchable.
And that shield held up for a long, long time. I mean, it worked.
It worked flawlessly because the institutions that were supposed to pierce it, the compliance departments at the banks, the federal prosecutors at the DOJ, were either too dazzled by the glare of that elite shield, or they were simply too afraid of the reputational risk of trying to dismantle it.
It's a really sobering realization. So as we wrap this deep dive up, what does this all mean for you listening right now? We are sitting here in 2026 looking back at events from 1996 and 2008.
I think we need to synthesize the three pillars we just spent time discussing. You had the money JP Morgan actively ignoring its own compliance officers to keep a highly lucrative client happy. You had the law of the DOJ in 2008 failing to challenge the status quo and hiding behind obscure concepts like federalism to avoid a tough, messy fight. And you had the network proven beyond a doubt by these flight logs that provided the ultimate social cover.
It was a perfect storm of institutional failure. Every single safety net that was designed to catch someone like him had a massive hole cut right in the middle of it.
And there's a profound irony in the timeline here. Think about it. In 2008, the system's immediate instinct was concealment. Hide the non-prosecution agreement, don't tell the victims, seal the records away. Now in 2026, under the Transparency Act, the instinct is over-collection. Dump absolutely everything onto a public website, even the fake political tips, and just let the public sort it out. It took nearly 20 years for the pendulum to swing from total secrecy to total saturation.
And somewhere in the middle of that wild pendulum swing is the actual truth.
Exactly. And that leads me to a final question I want to leave you with today. We have spent this time looking at reports from the past banking reports, OPR legal reports. We know for a fact now that the system prioritized reputational risk and bureaucratic logic over stopping a known predator. So my question is this. If that was the operating logic back then, do we really think human nature and institutional self-preservation have completely changed today?
That is a question, isn't it?
How many other open secrets are currently being protected in our major banks and legal offices right now? How many other suspicious activity files are sitting in a compliance folder somewhere, being ignored because the client brings in just a little too much revenue? The underlying logic of 2008 hasn't magically disappeared just because we released a bunch of PDFs in 2026.
That is a genuinely terrifying thought to end on, but a completely necessary one. We really can't just look at this as a history lesson. We have to look at it as an active warning about how our institutions actually function behind closed doors.
Ideally, yes. True transparency is the only way to force accountability.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. It's heavy stuff and frankly, a little exhausting to process, but understanding the machinery is the only way to make sure it doesn't happen again. We will catch you on the next one.